If you would give a esteemed audience an overview of your background, and then we'll talk about Hope Wins and all kinds of fun stuff.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Well, and also thank you for having me on today. So my background. Okay. So yes, you introduced me as Dr. Rose Brock. And as my friends like to call me, Dr. Rosalicious, which literally the day I defended my dissertation when I got my PhD, I came back to work. I was at that point a middle school librarian. And there was a lab coat, which, library science, you don't actually need the lab coat, but it was fun. And I still have it to this day. And across, there was they'd had it personalized, and it said Dr. Rosalicious, and I wear it proudly from time to time. So, so a little bit more about me. So I grew up, you didn't say how much more about me. I just said that I was going to say a little, but maybe I'll make it a lot. I grew up in Germany, and my family came to the United States when I was 9 years old. Back when we came, this was many years ago, and my family moved to Oklahoma, because my dad was in the military and had retired. And at that point, there wasn't an ESL program. And so, I was put actually in a special education program, and which is really an interesting kind of start, mostly because I struggled with reading because, I'd always been bilingual, but I'd gone to a German school and instruction in German, and then had transitioned to an American school right before we moved. And that made things a little challenging. So I had some great teachers, and fell in love with stories, and that's kind of been my world ever since. I, stayed in Oklahoma through college, was an English major, knew I wanted to be a teacher starting in about 5th grade, had an epiphany. I loved the classroom. I loved learning. I loved just that entire environment. But I did get in trouble a lot as a kid, mostly for talking in class, because I always had something to say that I was sure was brilliant. And my teachers inevitably, and this was a consistent pattern. I mean, in the Lawton public school system where I went from 4th grade through high school, it was like code 27, which was like talks too much. And I got those often because I always felt very inclined to contribute to the general conversation about what we were doing in class and many other things. So I knew I wanted to be a teacher, and that's exactly what I did. I got a degree in English, and then got my certification to teach. My family, my husband and I, moved to Dallas Fort Worth right after college, like immediately right after college. We had a U-Haul like 4 days later, and I started teaching, and I was a middle school teacher. So middle school people are my favorite people. I spent 20 years as a middle school educator. I transitioned from the classroom to a bigger classroom in the library upon the request of a principal that I had, who really generously offered me a chance to become our campus librarian. And the funny thing about that is, as much as I loved books, as much as stories were just always a part of my world, I didn't ever really envision myself being a librarian. And I'm not sure what the disconnect was, but it was just there. And so when she first approached me about becoming a librarian, I kind of guffawed because I thought, well, my hair is, way too cool to be a librarian, which is actually kind of funny. I bought into all those silly, ridiculous stereotypes. I don't rock a bun, although I could, but I don't. And, I wasn't so convinced that was what I needed to do, but she was absolutely sure of it. And when I pressed her to find out why, she had come to me, there were lots of other language arts teachers, and our librarian, who was a very lovely, kind woman, but ready for retirement. I'll just say that. Her response was, and it was one of the kindest things anyone's ever said to me. She gestured to my classroom and she said, "I want you to do this for the whole school." And that really spoke to my heart. And it was a kind of a leap of faith. So I transitioned. I went to library school, got my master's in library science. I had already worked on a master's in reading prior. And then after that, while I was in library school, I kind of fell in love with librarianship and realized, like, wow, I mean, being a classroom teacher is amazing, but the library, you can be impactful on all kids in the building, right? You're really changing like school culture if you do it right. And so jumped into the job, absolutely loved it. I finished that degree, and then I had some of my professors who approached me about staying on for a PhD, which again, not something I had ever envisioned for myself. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. So, I was already achieving more than maybe, was even the expectation. And so since then, once it took me a long time to get that PhD because I worked full time as a school librarian and had a family. But I did finish and became Dr. Rosalicious and transitioned at that point to academic work. I teach at Sam Houston State University in Huntsville, Texas. And it's a really wonderful university. I teach in the library science and technology department. And now I primarily teach children's literature and young adult literature. I teach some library science coursework too, because again, I was a practitioner for 13 years and love being a school librarian. I will always say it's still the best job I probably will ever have in my career of work. Librarians are heroes. And so I love getting to teach teachers that want to become librarians and take my experiences and try to, really nurture all the great stuff about them. But so that's what I've been doing. And then in my spare time, I do a couple other things, which we might talk about. I helped found a big book festival in Dallas-Fort Worth, and I've published 2 anthologies for young people. The first one was called Hope Nation, which is a young adult anthology. And then now just published Hope Wins, which is what we're going to talk about. I'm very excited to talk about that with you.
Well, first of all, to all librarians watching or listening, we love you, and your hair looks great.
Absolutely. Librarians they're amazing. And it is really kind of funny when we laugh about all those stereotypes, the buns, the shushing, those things don't really happen. I was, in my 13 years of being a school librarian, on 2 separate occasions, I was shushed as a librarian. Adults in my library shush me, and I was like, oh, hell no. This is my space. I mean, it's everybody's space, but you're not coming into my, I don't do that to kids. I don't do that to people. Libraries are active, busy places. They're just really the heart of schools, in my opinion. And I'm clearly right. So
100%. Would you be on this show if you weren't right? No.
Exactly.
Everybody who ever comes on this show, 100% correct. All librarians have great looking hair. That's just the way it is.
It is. And sensible shoes.
Is available now. Esteemed audience, get your copy, and we're going to talk about it. But I've got to know, how do you go? You said you're in special education classes because you have difficulty reading. Obviously, somewhere in there's something changes that you become a reading enthusiast, or this is just an incredible coincidence that you're doing all of this education and book-related things. So when does that shift, and how does it shift?
So I think, because and I don't want to make light of the challenges that English language learners have. I had some great advantage in that I was bilingual, from the beginning. But the difference was, just my instruction. I went to a German kindergarten in 1st and 2nd grade. So that shift, that's really kind of such a pivotal time for learning how to read. And I was learning in one language, and then it shifted to another language. So really, I didn't necessarily have any processing disorders that a lot of kids that end up in special education have. What happened was that they simply didn't really know what to do with me. They knew that I needed some small group instruction, that I needed some special care. And so, again, this is 40 years ago in a little town in Oklahoma. So at least those teachers were absolutely correct in what they did. I remember having a lot of shame, though, of being pulled out when language arts instruction was happening. At that time of the day, I would be collected and I would go to another space in a small group environment. And that really bothered me because it was embarrassing to me. At that moment, I remember thinking, everybody knows I'm not good enough. Everybody knows that there's something wrong with me. And, that's heartbreaking to think about those stigmas. And it made me think a lot, just as an educator in my classroom and in my libraries, about how we level playing fields. And we can talk about audiobooks and other things. But I think all those experiences really spoke to how I wanted to envision equity in classrooms and libraries, where you have a least restrictive environment where all kids can see themselves in that space. But so what happened was that teacher was so smart, and she read aloud to us, and she just read some of her favorite books. And what I would do is, she'd read Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing, and then when we were done, I would go check it out from the library and I would read it to myself. So what she had done was built scaffolding, because I already knew the story and I knew the characters, and so I could read it for enjoyment. And really, I've told people often, and I've even written about it when I was a doc student, that I credit Nancy Drew for turning me into a reader. And before I had real friends, I had those imaginary friends, Nancy and George and Bess, although I thought I was a much better friend to Nancy than they would ever be. But, it really speaks to the power, in my mind, it speaks to the power of series books for young people, and just growing passion for stories, because same kind of thing. Like, so I felt, I read The Secret of the Old Clock, and then I kept reading, and, like 30, 40 books later, because it was easier, and every book I read and consumed, I wanted to read the next one. I got better at the actual skills that go into reading. And so that really was the transition. I didn't have those, again, I didn't have any cognitive challenges that were making reading hard for me. I just wasn't practiced, and I was still working on some of those language transitions. I still struggle to spell in English sometimes, thank goodness for, I do okay, but English is a tricky language, and even if you can speak it, it doesn't mean you necessarily know how to write it, and just how phonetically, everything is there are a lot of languages, German being one of them, where things actually, are spelled like they sound, even if they sound really horrible. And so that's really what happened. That's how I went from one to the other, and it happened pretty quickly. So that fourth grade year, my first year there in school, was, we read some things that I really truly fell in love with. E.B. White's Trumpet of the Swan. We read Charlotte's Web too, but I fell in love with Trumpet of the Swan. We read, the Laura Ingalls Wilder's books, or Laura Ingalls Wilder books, which, we know today are very problematic. But at that point, that it was an adventure story or series for me. And then again, my beloved Nancy Drew. And so I just all of a sudden was consumed with stories I wanted to read all the time. And I was growing up, and, I just became such an avid reader that, like by the next year, I was actually what they considered on grade level. And, by the following year, I was put in gifted, for whatever that's worth. And then I just didn't really stop until I got a little older and got into some trouble. And then I took my reading underground. Depends on what kind of, if we want to keep this a family show, I won't tell you about that.
Well, tell me about it. We'll just edit out the parts that are appropriate.
Right. No, I'm being facetious. It's all appropriate. No, so so then I went into middle school or junior high back then. And, I was the kid that walked around school, like the girl with the big, thick Coke bottle glasses who read books as she was walking and bumped and stuff. Like, I was that stereotype too. And then I got contacts, and I tell everybody, contacts ruined my academic career in late junior high and high school, because all of a sudden, boys were noticing me. I was kind of cute. And I was like, well, I don't want to be that nerdy girl anymore. And so I stopped, I stopped being overt with my reading life. I stopped taking books to school where people saw me, and instead I was reading my Sweet Valley High and other classic 80s romance books at home, and just kind of were I was more secretive about it because I was so worried about appearance and so forth. And the thing that I recognize now as a grown up, so to speak, having that label, is that, what I didn't know how to contend with the idea that I could be, a cute girl and also, a bookish girl. And I certainly hope that young kids figure that out. I think that's something that always, identity is everything when you're that age. And I didn't know that I could be all those things. I do now, right? And so I'm happy to be a combination of those things. But back then I didn't. So I struggled in high school because I didn't do much academically. I went from being, again, in the gifted program to failing my freshman year of high school, and having to repeat that in summer school, going into my sophomore year, still technically as a freshman in high school because I didn't have enough credits, and having to play catch up for the rest of high school because of being a knucklehead really for 1 year.
You were failing just because you wanted to look cool, or?
Well, no, I was failing because I wasn't doing my homework. Not just, I mean, I became very social and had lots of different boyfriends and was, just getting into stuff I really had no business getting into. I always tell people that, my parents retired. I was the youngest of a family of 4 kids, and with a decade gap between my 3 older siblings and me. So by the time my parents were parenting me, it was pretty free range. And so I was making decisions for myself that I was not in an emotional or mature enough place to make for myself. So, my mom was an amazing woman, but she wasn't so much that she was hands off. She just trusted me more than probably she should have in many cases. So I made a lot of bad choices, to say the least. But I clearly turned it back around, and and figured it out eventually, and then went to college and did a much better job in college than I ever did in high school. So I was a late bloomer, so to speak, which is okay.
Well, I'm biased as somebody who also made some questionable choices along the way, but I think it's better to get those out of the way early and now I know for sure that's not the path I want to take, and I can course correct for going forward.
Absolutely. And I think in looking back at all of it, I do think it 100% made a profound difference on me as an educator, and probably even in the work I do today, I think it still is impactful, because when I was a classroom teacher and a librarian, I would see those kids, the ones that were clearly bright, but just had no real work ethic, or just weren't motivated. There was something out there they were into, and they weren't interested in playing school, as I always called it. And those were the kids that, I really loved. And I tried not to write them off, because I knew that it was very likely there was a whole lot more to them. And if they could just find their own way eventually, that they would be great. And thanks to social media, I have had the good fortune of seeing a lot of those kids that really struggled. They find me on Facebook or whatever, and I get to see them be grown-ups with families and successful in their lives. And it's really, I only had a glimpse of that. In a very small role, but I certainly didn't give up cheering for them. I had hope for them. My brand.
Yes, you are a hope dealer.
I am.
Before we get to all the hope, I must say that one of the great tragedies, there's so many tragedies of humanity, but one of the great tragedies is that reading is not a far more attractive quality. That should be the most attractive quality. You're looking for a mate, that one's thinking. That one has useful ideas that will be useful to you. Go talk to them.
Absolutely. And what's funny is that my husband of 29 years, who I met in high school, a little later though, we went to different junior highs. He totally, we're kind of ridiculous in that, I've had friends say, looking at pictures of us back in the 80s, they'll say, y'all look like John Hughes characters, which is kind of true. He's like he was the, captain of the baseball team, but also wicked smart. And, and I had been the naughty girl that kind of self-corrected. And that's one of the things he loves about me. He loves that I care so much about stories and learning and all that today. He had to, there was a little leap of faith for a while that, he had to kind of make peace with all the, trouble I'd gotten into, but it was fine. And I think he also liked that. I think there was a part of him that probably appreciated me being a little naughty. But he definitely digs my bookish ways, for sure.
I'm not editing out anything from that. That was absolutely charming.